All right, so here we have a topic that's all about sex. Clearly, it is independent from the topic on gender, but clearly there's a large overlap between these two questions. So we can talk about sexual identity. Um, it's very similar to gender role identity that we talked earlier, but now we're talking more sex side of rather than. And so clearly we can have a sexual orientation or preferences for you know what. All right. Physiological influences. As we said, the sex differentiation occurs prenatally. I said it in the last topic. Fetuses begin as female only if particular androgens are present. Does it pop out the female systems and allow the males to emerge? Estrogens are the hormones that are typically associated with females and enhance the female characteristics. All right. Psychosocial influences. Yeah, becoming a sexual person. This is interesting. That um, families have different levels of discussion or lack of about sex. We find that peers are the leading source of information about sex, but often misinformation. Clearly, the internet is also an interesting source of misinformation. Schools have often had these abstinence only programs, um, which are the product of conservative school boards. I'm sorry, I'm political. And they do not work. Instead, abstinence only programs simply create an uneducated group of students that are going to have sex anyway, but they just don't know anything about it. Okay? So it's just they don't work. There's just lots of obviously religion plays a very large role teaching children what is and is not acceptable. It tends to create guilt about sexual activity. I've always had this thought in my head that the Catholic Church's views on homosexuality are creating some huge problems because when children are growing up in a Catholic church and they have these mixed these mixed sexual feelings, they're being told these are wrong. You should suppress those and put those away, and that doesn't work. You can't just pretend they don't exist, okay? But you know, all right. Ooh, wrong direction. Here it is. Ah, oh, there it is. How did you learn about sex? Oh, come on. We all heard it at school, right? Well, it turns out that studying about sex is actually really hard to do. Because, well, number one, participants tend to have a liberal bias because, as we said, more conservative people don't talk about sex. And so it could be, you know, these conservative people do in fact have freaky sex lives, but they just won't talk about it. Or even if they do talk about it, they won't be truthful. They won't tell you. And so we find in all of the critical studies on sex, you know, we're talking Alfred Kinsey, Masters and Johnson as the big ones. They've been accused, and rightfully so, that they have an unrepresentative sample. And so all of a sudden, all of the findings that they have come to only represent that group that are willing to join their samples. So there is some truth to that. Hard science. Gender differences. Men are yeah, usually have more interest in sex. There's more of a connection between sex and intimacy for women than there is for men. Men, there's more likely to have aggression linked to sex, especially if pornography is added to the mixture. Women's sexuality seems to be more influenced by culture than males are. Males are more biologically oriented towards sex. In straight couples, men usually initiate, women usually when and where. And yeah, and that by the way is true in throughout the animal kingdom, right? Because men are more biological, but in all animal species. Okay, so what Alfred Kinsey found, and this was back in the 40s, early 50s. I don't know. There was an interesting movie. I think Liam Neeson played Alfred Kinsey, and it was an interesting. It really showed the difficulty Alfred Kinsey had in finding research participants. He had to go to some pretty seedy parts of town to find people that would volunteer to be in his study. So this major criticism about an unrepresentative sample is 100% true. But what Alfred Kinsey did in fact point out, which is critical, is just like we had talked about in the last topic, that these gender roles are not like, strong versus weak or something like that. Instead, everything falls along a continuum. And so Alfred Kinsey even says even sexuality falls along a continuum. That pure heterosexuality and pure homosexuality are sort of like two ends, two opposite ends of an extreme, with everybody falling somewhere in between. Okay? Um, there doesn't seem to be any connection between parents' sexual orientation and children's sexual orientation, which has been one of the largest criticisms that conservatives have had about same-sex couples adopting. All right, but there just doesn't seem to be any connection between here. There does seem to be some genetics. There absolutely appears to be a genetic relationship with homosexuality. There's even hormonal influences. In fact, as an interesting side, I don't think if I have it on another slide, I'll skip it, but here it is that the mothers can emit particular hormones during certain stages of pregnancy that can influence the rate of homosexuality. So I'm going to make up these numbers. These are made up. Just get the pattern, not the exact numbers. So let's say, for example, if a woman has her first child and it's a boy, there's a 5% chance that that boy is homosexual, something like that. Now, the same woman has a second child who's a boy. The second boy has like a 10% chance of being homosexuality. If she has a third boy, then the probability that third boy will be homosexual is like 25%. So all of a sudden it jumps like this. And from an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense because we lived in, humans lived in these extended family type clans, and related males were competition, right? I mean, if there's three, four, five males and they're all brothers, they share the same genetic material. And now they're all in competition for a limited number of females, right, for mating. Well, guess what happens? If one of those males happens to be homosexual, then that male will not compete for the females, but will in fact help in the procurement of resources for the group. Okay, and it's like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so clearly the woman's body has some ability in some way or another to regulate this kind of a thing. Homophobia. Yeah, we know homophobia. And they're waxing and waning. They're up, they're down. Like many of these discriminations, prejudices, it depends on how you ask the question. It depends upon whether you ask people publicly or privately. And so we find that publicly exposed, but we find levels of homophobia are highest for those people with the least education. So just like all prejudice, you can educate out the blatant part, but who knows about the what did we call it? It was blatant and subtle, yeah, subtle. So who knows? Okay. And then sexual orientation doesn't. Oh, here we go. Doesn't seem to impact psychological functioning. But the discrimination people receive will potentially create problems. Here is an interesting one right now. We've got, okay, here it is. You see this? Here's an image. Extramarital sex is always wrong. And you see moving from 87 to whatever that reads on the bottom. 98? 98, yeah. You see people got more conservative on this question of extramarital sex is always wrong. But they become less conservative on this homosexual sex is always wrong. But it's a scary business because it's still pretty damn high. I mean, really high. Okay? Here, entering collegians agreeing that it is important to have laws prohibiting homosexual relations. And so you can see it peaked at 53%, but it's dropped considerably since then. But again, it's a scary thought that 27% of people still believe that there should be laws against. Wow, okay? Even that scares me a little bit. But clearly things are changing because right now in the current political climate, this is, summer 2018. One of the top tier candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination is, in fact, Pete Buttigieg, who is openly and unapologetically gay. So there is at least some level of acceptance, though I still think that you're going to have at least 27% of people, like in here, that would not vote for him because he's gay. And we'll have to see how this pans out. But the very fact that he can be even considered in the running in the top tier at this point is revealing of something. So we'll talk about sexual orientation as a combination of nature and nurture. Because I'll tell you, stepping back, I remember this is probably 10 years ago now, but there was a bishop, I think the Bishop of Cincinnati. So he's a bishop in the Catholic Church. And he writes an article supporting how homosexuality is a result of biological processes and therefore not a choice. Okay? So what happened was the Catholic Church basically condemned this bishop. All right, that's it. You're out of the church. Because here is how it goes. Can you imagine this? Imagine I say to you, for example, it's a sin to be short. And you're like, wait, what? That doesn't even make sense, because you can't choose whether or not you're short. How can something be a sin if you don't choose it, right? That doesn't even make sense. So this bishop's paper, which basically says homosexuality is not a choice, has all of a sudden put homosexuality in the same realm as height. It is what it is. It's a product of biology, and it's not a conscious choice you make. You can't be a sin. It can't be a sin if it's not a product of a conscious choice. And so all of a sudden, wow, what a scary business, and that is the justification on that side. So with that being said, let's look at the evidence for nature versus nurture in a scientific fashion. Simon LeVay is the preeminent gay neuropsychologist. I don't know what that means, but anyway, he's a neuropsychologist who's famous for being gay and studying brain differences in homosexuality. And there are absolutely differences in the brains of heterosexual and homosexual men. There's absolute, clear, measurable differences. Differences in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the anterior hypothalamus. I mean, don't worry what they are. Gay men have brains that are much more similar to females than to males. You find that the gay females look more male than female, right? It works in both directions. But this is clearly correlational data, because what happens is, it's like, okay, imagine this. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is different. So it's like, was the difference in the suprachiasmatic nucleus the reason somebody was gay, or was being gay the reason that they have a different suprachiasmatic nucleus? I don't know. Okay, so it's true, but we don't know why. We don't know what the directions are. Here's another version of the image I had put up in the last topic. So here is, ability to solve these mental rotations. And so you've got the image on the left, and then it's like, which of these three, or four rather, is the same as the image on the left, something like that. And what happens is straight males are way good at this thing relative to straight females, but you can see gays and lesbians right there, smack up in the middle, are right smack in the middle between the ability of the males and the females. I was like, wow, that is really, really interesting. We find that if one member of an identical twin pair is gay, then there's a high chance that the other will be as well. 52%. So these numbers, 52 and 48, are way higher than random chance. Random chance would be like 5% or something. Even 22% of gay fraternal male twins had a gay brother. Okay, so it's not even just the identicals; it's even the fraternals. The half brothers. But at the same time, more than half had a heterosexual, right? So it's really kind of an interesting thing. There seems to be a genetic component, but in order to understand the genetics behind homosexuality, we need to very, very briefly discuss the idea of the epigenome. Okay. Now, we know a little bit about genetics, right? The genes are those things that the genes are the code underneath that determine what it looks like on the surface, right? And I'm not teaching genetics today, but maybe genotype, phenotype, right? And so the genes are the code for what you look like on the surface. But what happens is that on top of the genome is what's called the epigenome. And I'm going to keep it incredibly simple here. The epigenome is basically a set of switches that can be on or off. Okay, and so somebody might have a gene for homosexuality, and it's there, it's on the genome, and the genes do in fact, they're the code that writes what it looks like on the surface. But the epigenome can be turned in the off position or in the on position. It appears that the epigenome is in fact influenced, is modified based on experiences in your lifetime. And so the experiences in your lifetime can turn these epigenetic switches on or off, which determine which of the genes do in fact manifest them. And so you could be carrying the homosexual gene, but having the epigenetic switch in the off position and never expressing that particular characteristic. So it's kind of an interesting way to balance out this idea and to help us to explain how you can have, identical twins, one gay and one not, right? Because they have the exact same genetic material, but they might have a different pattern of epigenetic switching. Prenatal hormones. It turns out stress hormones are, if you give stress hormones to pregnant rats, then the pups will have the same types of abnormal development that gay individuals have or homosexual individuals have. During the second trimester, when the central nervous system is developing, we find that obviously we can't do this kind of a study with humans, but we find that in an analogous situation, in mothers that are exposed to a lot of stress during this second trimester, have children that have homosexual or that are homosexual at a much higher rate than the average. Really? You castrate a rat early and then they show more? I didn't know that. But it's unrelated to testosterone per se. Remember, testosterone is that typical male hormone, and so the male hormone is the one that expresses things like aggression and things like that. So it's not necessarily related to homosexuality per se. There's not a difference in them. Biological correlates. Wow, I can't even read all of that. Okay, that's basically just a summarization of all of those things I've been saying. Okay, good. Um, how about nurture or choice? Um, it was all based on Freudian theory. And you know what? Up until 1971, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder in the APA, in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We'll talk more about that one at some point coming up still. But it's not anymore, okay? It's not. And it's like they've looked. People, I mean, scientists have looked. They've looked. They haven't found any environmental component to homosexuality. There's just zero evidence that there's nurture involved in this. It appears to be a fairly well 100% nature kind of thing. All right, so that's always an interesting one. But now let's talk about perhaps the something that is relevant to all human beings, perhaps. This is the work of Masters and Johnson, just like Kinsey. Again, this is biased work. This is anything that we see and discuss here is what participants that would volunteer to go into their study would report. And so they got people to volunteer to do all kinds of crazy things in their laboratory. And so what they did was they found that the sexual response cycle goes through these four phases: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. Okay? And during the resolution, during these different phases, we can see underneath my head here that men in blue and women in red, men tend to proceed through the cycle faster than women, and so men tend to have that, or orgasm before. Yeah. Well, we'll just leave that for you to, dissect yourself. But you see right there is that women have the ability after the resolution phase to peak again. Males, generally speaking, do not. Women are less likely during blah 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 blah. Wow. I will just, let you read that stuff because my name is not Dr. Pugh. I don't like to drop all that crazy stuff. Okay. So, blah 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 blah. Can't add anything to that. Wow, I'm going to totally and let you say those words to yourself. They're nice words. Okay, so I don't know what to say about that. Yes, sex can look in all kinds of different ways, and it is perfectly normal. All kinds of crazy. Listen to me, crazy, and it's normal, right? All kinds of different things are perfectly normal. And we'll just leave that to you and your partner to discover. Okay, so clearly we had many generations where sex was traditionally reserved only for after marriage only. Now, clearly, that's not true. I mean, it's like, all right, how about this? I'll give you some admission here. My great grandfather, let's just say, he was a player apparently. So he's like 25 years old or something. And he meets my grandma who was like 14 or something, and he gets her pregnant. Right? Whatever. Okay, so this would have been 1923. So it was a long time ago. And then what happened was my aunt, who was born as a product of this out of marriage relationship, was born and was taught from the beginning that she was the ultimate product of sin and would never be able to be forgiven. Okay, and she became a Catholic nun. She basically, the day she turned 15, she joined the convent, and off she went. Okay, so it's a real shame that it was that way. But it was just, if it was outside of a marital relationship, then it was just the product of evil. And it was like, but yeah, I'm sorry, people did it forever and ever. Okay, it was just the way it was. Now, obviously, things have changed with, especially with online apps and whatnot. What do I know? Okay, I'm not a product of this generation. But clearly, the older traditional models of relationships have, in fact, changed quite a bit. Blah blah blah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. All right. We'll just let that ride because you can read this stuff, right? Yeah. Yeah. Really, I didn't know that. Gay men engage in sex more frequently. I didn't. I'm not sure. I remember pulling that piece of information out before. All right. Where is it? Contraception. Yeah, that's interesting. About half of all pregnancies are unplanned. Yeah, and so right now we're in the middle of the whole abortion controversy in America, and it's a problematic thing. Um, I'm going to tell you what my understanding is that there's many states that have been putting these 4 or 6 week what they're calling heartbeat bills in place. And these heartbeat bills, the idea is there is a belief. It depends on who you ask. Some people believe that life begins the moment egg meets sperm. Okay. And so some people believe that, because what happens is many forms of contraception, what they do is, let's say, for example, the pill. What the pill does is, if a fertilized egg travels down the fallopian tube and gets to the uterus, if a woman is on the pill, then most of the time the uterus will reject that fertilized egg. Okay? And so therefore implantation will never occur. But many people believe that that fertilized egg, as it's traveling down the fallopian tube, is life. Okay? So I wouldn't be surprised if a move towards banning birth control wasn't coming in this current conservative judicial climate. Um, I hope I'm wrong, but many people believe that there's lots of different distinction. When does life begin? And a lot of people believe that when the heart starts beating, that's life. And it's like, even if that's your judgment, and that is the heartbeat is the rationale for these heartbeat abortion laws, which are now 4 or 6 weeks. And what's happening is they claim, okay, the moment we can hear the heartbeat, but the fact is that the electronic equipment that they use to detect the heartbeat is so incredibly powerfully good. It's not detecting a heartbeat. It's detecting cellular. I mean, it's just detecting nothing. It's not heartbeat at 4 or 6 weeks. The heart is not beating at that point. But you can detect a sound, but it's not a heartbeat that you're hearing. It's other cellular activity going on. So I'm having problems with it simply because well, in fact, there's this one argument that has some merit to it, and this is a little bit strange. It sounds crazy, but perhaps you know Roe versus Wade, which is about 1973, which was a Supreme Court case which made abortion legal, legalized abortion. Well, it turned out that crime in the 1980s was getting out of control in America. It was just so bad, especially in New York City. And so in rolls Rudy Giuliani as the mayor of New York City, okay? And he's going to be tough on crime. And so they put in place all kinds of crazy rules to be tough on crime. In fact, they had this, zero tolerance policy. The Rudy Giuliani's belief or was, look, all crime ultimately looks like this. Well, spitting on the street is illegal, right? But you know what? Who's going to stop me? And so it's just like all crime just sort of creeps its way up. Crime is incremental, it's not a yes versus a no. And so if spitting on the street is okay, then so is littering. And if littering is okay, then so is stealing a newspaper from the machine. If stealing a newspaper is okay, then and it just he had this belief that crime was this kind of growing process. So he put in place a policy: zero flexibility. If you commit anything, if you jaywalking, you will get arrested immediately. Okay, so it was a zero tolerance policy. And BTW, he also implemented a lot of stop and frisk. Whatever, leave that to you. Well, all of a sudden, crime plummeted. And Rudy Giuliani, look at me. I am America's mayor. I am awesome. Look what I did. I took a crime-filled city. I saved it. And then some researchers went back and looked at it and said, okay, let's look at that Roe versus Wade thing, okay? Because Roe versus Wade was 1973. And so all of a sudden what's happening is somewhere around 1988, 1989, those babies that were aborted due to Roe versus Wade and didn't were going to be 16, 17, 18 in around 1990, and those are the ones that are going to be committing crimes. And what happened was those children that were coming from poverty environment, those children that would have been most likely to have been committing those crimes were not born. Okay, and so Rudy Giuliani's claiming that he was solved all of this crime may have simply been the result of the abortions that became legalized due to Roe versus Wade. Although it's a controversial thing, but it's whatever. I guess I get off on a sidetrack. Contraception is, yes, it's a two-sided responsibility. Um, I think I have, yeah, contraception is a two-sided responsibility. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, if you have strong opinions on the abortion debate, either way, either direction, it is inherent upon you to study how this birth control works. Because, as I said, I wouldn't be surprised if our current conservative political climate isn't going to be attacking birth control soon, because depending on how you define life, different forms of birth control, especially like the morning after pill, but even these other forms of birth control, depending on who you are, can be considered to be abortions by some people. Okay? Clearly, they're one of the biggest problems is sexually transmitted diseases. It's it's interesting that it's highest incidence in those under 25. Yeah, HIV has increased, but it's interesting now when I was growing up in my teenage years, well, through freshman year in college, AIDS was a brand new thing. It was incredibly scary, and it was a death sentence. Okay, it was death. So clearly, sexually transmitted diseases were had a bigger impact on behaviors when I was in college than other generations would. Um, Nowadays, however, sexually transmitted diseases have not a cure, but maintenance. All right, prevention, abstinence. Ah, yes, yes, okay, well, yeah. Don't have sex with a lot of people. Good advice. Oh my goodness, that's absolutely crazy. Okay, before 1900, 3% of 18-year-olds had experienced premarital sex. Nowadays, it's more like 50. That's baloney. 3% of 18-year-olds reported premarital sex. That doesn't make it true. Okay, we all know that. Yeah, and it's a real shame that anytime my kids' schools would have anything to do with sex ed, they would always send home permission slips and force me to sign. Do you give your child permission to learn these sex things? I was like, I think all kids need to know this, no matter what. But I guess children are property, right? My children until they're 18 are my property, and I guess it's my choice just like the anti-vaxxers can choose not to vaccinate their children, dumbasses. So, it doesn't always work, and there are clearly sexual disorders. I can tell you, I can't really add much above and beyond what you can read here, because what do I know? You want to get the skinny on this stuff, go talk to Dr. Pugh, all right? She'll talk your ear off on this for a month, okay? And likewise, I'm just going to say go see Dr. Pugh if you want to get all the details, all right? But there is therapy for these issues. All right, good. Now that I'm done with that uncomfortable topic, shall we say, one that I am not as comfortable with as Dr. Pugh might be. So we'll talk to you the next time. I think we're going to move into work. All right, that'd be very cool. A discussion of industrial organizational psychology and the role work plays in our lives.